Hey family, I'm back here with you again for another one. We're going to go back in history a little bit to take a look at what is happening now and the connection. And I'm going to be following up this video with a second one to sort of put it all into perspective so we can have a great overview and knowledge of what is happening now. So, back in 1962, for about 13 days, beginning on what was the 16th of October, I guess you can see the whole earth was on high alert amidst what was seen at that time as an unprecedented crisis. So, photographs taken by, at that time, what was the American U-2 spy plane, had shown suspicious construction activity across Cuba. They would later confirm that this was an installation of Soviet nuclear missiles and infrastructure. And it was quickly determined that the missiles that were being set up and installed in Cuba was the SS-4 Sandal and the SS-5 Skian. And both these missiles, of course, were capable of striking the territory of the United States. Now, the president at the time was John F. Kennedy, and his options, they said at that time, was very limited. And the timeline until the missiles became operational was very short. So, the U.S. Joint Chief of Staff at the time had strongly advocated for an immediate military response. And they also wanted that to be followed by a removal of the Cuban president who had just taken over through, of course, fighting against the powers. Castro had come into power through, I guess you can say, an independence fight. So the plan was to have a military response and to remove Castro from power. Some of those in the U.S. government, however, had urged for talks and diplomacy. And the Secretary of Defense at the time, who was Robert McNamara, wanted to have a naval blockade as an alternative. However, Kennedy was concerned that this would lead to a possible nuclear exchange. And ultimately, he decided that a blockade was not something that he wanted to do. Simply because a blockade would have been seen legally as an act of war, right? So what they did was they called the blockade a quarantine, right? So this quarantine came alongside what would have been several, of course, conversations they had with the Premier Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union at the time. And of course, Kennedy was demanding a removal of all offensive weapons in Cuba. Now, Khrushchev, it said, had viewed the quarantine as an ultimatum, right? And a perception that JFK's task force had wanted to avoid. Now, Khrushchev had penned a letter to JFK, and he'd called the U.S. actions an open violation of international law under the UN Charter. And Khrushchev ordered his ships to continue to Cuba, right? Since there were no weapons on board, the U.S. Navy permitted those ships to proceed. Now, in the meantime, Castro, who was fearing a U.S. invasion, urged Khrushchev to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against the United States. And of course, Khrushchev was not prepared to do that, because actually what Khrushchev was trying to do was trying to use this whole situation of leverage because of what was going on in Germany at the time. Because we need to realize that the Cold War between the powers started right after World War II. On one side you had NATO, on the other side you had the Warsaw Pact. And we'll get into that at another time. Some of you may be familiar with it, that were probably of age during that time. So we come forward to the 27th of October, same year, and when Cuban soldiers shot down a U.S. plane carrying out a reconnaissance mission over Cuba. And the pilot was killed. So by now things had reached a crescendo, yeah? And Kennedy could, because of that, could now argue that the Soviets had fired on the United States first. And this, he saw, granted him legal authority to conduct counterstrikes. And so all this went back and forth, back and forth. And of course, at a last-ditch effort at peace, Kennedy's brother, who was the Attorney General at the time, Robert Kennedy, and the Soviet ambassador at the time met to discuss different avenues of cooperation of how we could, how they could strike a deal. And of course, a deal was struck, and this crisis was averted. But if we come forward to now, well, many of us know that history is cyclical, and there's always something in that history lurking under the ground. And of course, we're going to see what is happening now in this time. We see that things are changing to what is being referred to as a multipolar world or Earth. Now, as opposed to unipolar, ruled by one sovereign, which many will say that sovereign was, of course, the United States. And we're going to see how all that ties into now. So I'm going to put up a quick video. I want you to look at the video and think about what is going on. And I may come back at the end for a comment.
2 days ago, Putin warned the West that he would strategically position weapons in countries bringing the West within its striking range. It did not take the Russian leader too long to act. It is the 7th of June 2024, and the world is staring at what could possibly be another Cuban crisis. You heard that right. Russian warships are all set to dock in Havana. Have a look at what Cuba has told the world. It says a group of Russian ships will be visiting Havana next week. These are not your luxury cruise ships, by the way. These are Russian naval ships. Frigate Gorshkov, the fleet oil tanker Pashin, and the rescue tug Nikolai Chika. There's also a nuclear-powered submarine Kazam. As per the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces, these Russian ships will visit the port of Havana between the 12th of June and the 17th of June. The question is, what will these warships do in Cuba? Will they send a message to the US and the NATO? Russia and Cuba, remember, are Cold War allies. Cuba hosted Soviet nuclear missiles in 1962. The John F. Kennedy-led US administration decided to impose a naval blockade around Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis nearly tipped the world into a nuclear war. 62 years on, Russian nuclear-powered submarine has made a port call in Havana. The Admiral Gorshkov is no ordinary warship. It is the lead vessel of Russia's latest class of frigates. The warship was commissioned in 2018. It can be armed with Zircon, Caliber, and Onyx cruise missiles. Look at the range of these missiles. The 3M22 Zircon Russian medium-range cruise missile has a range of 1,000 kilometers. Let's just pull out a map for you. This is Havana, where the Russian fleet will be docking. And this is Miami, the closest American city. The air distance between Havana and Miami is barely 366 kilometers. Zircon, like we told you, can travel up to 1,000 kilometers, meaning it can strike as far as South Carolina. Let's look at another missile that can be launched from the Russian warship docking in Havana, the Caliber missile. It has a much larger range. It can hit targets that are as far as 2,500 kilometers, meaning it is capable of striking New York, Washington, D.C., Dallas, St. Louis, even Chicago. You realize why this is a huge story? This is essentially Putin telling the West that his threats are not empty. The warship that will be docking in Havana is also capable of firing Otwet anti-submarine missile. The submarine Kazan will also be docking in Havana. It's a Yasen M submarine. It was launched in 2017. It is powered by the fourth generation KTP-6 nuclear reactors. Reports say Kazan is the quietest Russian underwater submarine. Kazan entered service with the Northern Fleet in 2021. It also can carry Onyx and Caliber cruise missiles. As per the TASS report published in 2021, Kazan can be configured to carry Zircon hypersonic missiles, and reports say this is the first time that a Russian Yasen M class submarine will be docking on a foreign port. The question is what explains the timing? We began the broadcast by reminding you that earlier this week, Putin said that he could be arming Western adversaries. Let me just read out for you the exact quote. If they consider it possible to deliver such weapons to the combat zone to launch strikes on our territory and create problems for us, why don't we have the right to supply weapons of the same type to some regions of the world where they can be used to launch strikes on sensitive facilities of the countries that do it to Russia? We will think about it, quote unquote. What you have now is Putin backing that threat with real action. Cuba claims none of the ships are carrying nuclear weapons. Even if that's true, Cuba is the last place the US would want Russian weapons to reach. Things have been tense between the US and Cuba since Fidel Castro overthrew a US-backed government. The year was 1959. Russia and Cuba, on the other hand, have only come closer in the recent years. Just last month, the Cuban president was in the Kremlin. He met Putin and attended the annual May 9 parade on Red Square. When the Russian fleet arrives at the port of Havana, one of the ships will fire 21 salvos. This will be Russia's salute to Cuba. And in return, Cuba's Revolutionary Armed Forces will fire artillery battery. The sound of this exchange will send the US down uncomfortable pages of history.
So this time, family, things have come full circle. But there are some significant differences, and those significant differences is the fact that the U.S. is unable to do anything to stop what is happening. And this is something that we need to be paying very close attention to. The proximity of Cuba to the United States is, I think, at its closest point, 90 miles. Additionally, Cuba has been under sanctions by the United States for a long time, continues to be, have never really lifted them. And in Cuba right now, things are terrible. And of course, there is no love affair between Cuba and the United States. So this situation and the ships and the submarine that is being sent there is very, very, very significant. And I've spoken before that there's going to come a time that the United States is spread so thin that it will not be able to defend itself. And it will be surrounded from all corners, from east to south to west, and possibly even from the north, the way they understand their directions, of course. But yes. So we're going to watch and we're going to wait and see what the next move on the board is going to be, because it's going to be significant. Until that time, family, I just say we need to stay prayed up, be before the Most High, keeping His statutes and commandments, and I will see you on the next one.